So it should come as no surprise to us that the left dislikes Ayn Rand for her capitalist politics. That's not surprising. But what is maybe surprising and a little odd and maybe a little disturbing is that today we see elements of the left attacking Ayn Rand not just for her political beliefs, but specifically for her atheism. Now, decades ago, this was something that was done only by the religious right, and they did it with a vengeance. But the left attacking her for that reason is, as far as I can tell, a relatively recent phenomenon. So if you think that today's left consistently defends secular values and the separation of church and state, it is unfortunately time to think again. And I'll offer an example here. This is from the left-wing organization, American Values Network. And they recently attacked Ayn Rand on their webpage and then with a related video, and this led to numerous other articles elsewhere in the media. And I just want to read you a bit from their webpage, which features this issue. GOP leaders and conservative parties have brought upon themselves a crisis of values. Many who for years have been the loudest voices invoking the language of faith and moral values are now praising atheist philosopher Ayn Rand, whose teachings stand in direct contradiction to the Bible. Rand advocates the law of selfishness over love and commands her followers to think only of themselves, not others. She said her followers had to choose between Jesus and her teachings. GOP leaders want to argue that they are defending Christian principles. As conservative evangelical icon Chuck Colson recently stated, Christians cannot support Rand's philosophy and Christ's teachings. The choice is simple: Ayn Rand or Jesus Christ. We must choose one and forsake the other. Now let's leave aside the idea that American Values Network is distorting the actual views of Rand. She did advocate love and appropriate thoughtfulness toward others, but that's not our point today. Instead, I want to focus on the difference between arguing against Rand's political and moral ideas based on evidence and reason versus what they're doing, which is saying we should reject these ideas because they're not religious. So what American Values Network is doing here is presuming that there is and should be a religious foundation for politics, and not only any just general religion, right? A specific religion, Christianity, with their sacred text, the Bible. And I think that whether you're an atheist or a religious advocate of the separation of church and state, that trend should frighten you. Unfortunately, though, it is part of a larger trend which I can describe as the rise of the religious left, which is becoming more and more of a cultural force. And my worry is that if we should ever have a convergence someday on the social agenda of the religious right and the economic agenda of the religious left, well, then my attitude is something like, may God help us all. So let's turn to Ayn Rand as an atheist intellectual. And largely I want to let Rand speak for herself by just quoting some of her important works. Now, I have noticed, it's occurred to me, that Ayn Rand is not universally beloved in atheist and skeptical communities. Maybe you've read some of Michael Shermer's criticisms. Another example, I read Sam Harris's book on ethics recently, and I was struck by his powerful arguments against moral relativism, which that's the part of Sam Harris I like the most. And yet I thought, geez, Ayn Rand broke much of the same ground decades earlier. Yet she merits not a single mention in his book, not even a footnote. But again, my goal here is not to persuade you today that Rand is correct as far as her moral and political views are concerned. Instead, I want to show that she was a major 20th century atheist thinker, and that she in fact made very powerful arguments against mysticism and faith in general, and specifically faith-based politics. And as a matter of strategy, I think it's worthwhile for skeptics, atheists, to note the popularity of Rand. Her books, decades after her death, continue to sell in the hundreds of thousands per year, which is pretty impressive. And also the sympathy for Rand in some conservative circles, in order to use that as a jumping off point to advocate the separation of church and state. I think that strategically could be effective. So let's look a bit at Ayn Rand's background. And I want to move chronologically through her life, roughly, because I want to point out that she was in fact an atheist through the course of her career, though of course she developed in sophistication in her criticisms of religion as she went. She was born in 1905 in St. Petersburg, which then became Petrograd, then Leningrad, then St. Petersburg. Culturally, she was born into a Jewish family, so she did not have strong Christian influences growing up. In fact, she didn't even have strong religiously Jewish influences growing up. And of course, the culture around her was not of strong Christian movement, right? It was the rise of communism, which was antagonistic to religion, basically. And so that's basically the culture that she found herself in in her early life. She moved to America in 1926. So I'll just point out that this is some 50 years before Jerry Falwell launched the so-called moral majority around 1976. Right, so just get a picture of what she was thinking about in her early life versus maybe her later life. So I want to start off in 1932, which is when she sold her first professional work, which was a screen treatment. She worked in films early in her life. And it was called Red Pond. You might guess on the title that it's mostly about the evils, what she sees as the evils of the Soviet dictatorship. But she does have some elements on religion, even in that early work. So I want to quote from one of the characters, Commandant Karyev, who's talking about duty as opposed to reason, right? To give us the idea that she's really an advocate of reason early on. And he says this: when it's a duty, you don't ask why and whom. You don't ask any questions. When you come up against a thing about which you can't ask any questions, that's when you know you're facing your duty. And then I want to consider this later description of the same character. He stood at the door. At one side of him was a painting of a saint burning at the stake, renouncing the pleasures and tortures of the flesh for the glory of his heaven. At the other side, a poster of a huge machine with little ant-sized men, sweating at its gigantic levers, and the inscription, "Our duty is our sacrifice to the Red Collective of the communistic state." So even here, I just wanted to point out some of her early atheistic themes in nascent form. One is, for Rand, clearly atheism is not enough. It's not a positive philosophy. It's just a lack of something, no theism. So for Rand, you could be an atheist and have all kinds of wrong and crazy ideas and still be an atheist, right? So what's important is your positive philosophy. Already we're getting Rand's focus on this earthly realm, not some transcendent realm or heaven. We're seeing Rand focus on reason, not authority. Now, interestingly, religion offers us the authority of the spokespeople of God, self-proclaimed often, or the authority of some sacred texts like the Bible, whatever. And for Rand, what she sees is that dictators are largely replacing or substituting the authority of religion with the authority of the state or the spokespeople of the state. So agree with the political conclusions or not, I think that that's an interesting parallel that she's drawing, and at least her focus is on reason. In ethics, of course, she's looking over reason having something to do with ethics over some sort of baseless or groundless duty. She's looking for values for specific individuals. You, and me, right? Not some grand transcendent realm of values or some sort of collective good above the good of particular people. So jumping ahead a few years to 1936, this is when Rand wrote We the Living, or published We the Living, which was largely autobiographical about Soviet Russia, and so again, you might expect largely political in nature. But here also we're getting some religious ideas. So I just want to relate a quick exchange between two of the characters, Kira and Andre. And Kira starts, "Do you believe in God, Andre?" "No." "Neither do I, but it's a favorite question of mine, an upside-down question." "What do you mean?" "Well, if I asked people whether they believe in life, they'd never understand what I meant. It's a bad question. It can mean so much that it really means nothing. So I ask them if they believe in God, and if they say they do, then I know they don't believe in life." "Why?" "Because you see, God, whatever anyone chooses to call God, is one's highest conception of the highest possible. And whoever places his highest conception above his own possibility thinks very little of himself in his life. It's a rare gift to him to feel reverence for your own life and to want the best, the greatest, the highest possible here now for your very own. To imagine a heaven and then not to dream of it, but to demand it." So again, we're seeing Rand's concern with the values in this world, not some transcendent world. She's very idealistic about values. She thinks that values are possible here in this life. She thinks that this life, if we live it the right way, is enough. Right? We don't have to save up everything for heaven and expect that's when we're really going to be happy after we die. And another interesting strain here is that religion, Rand is suggesting, is to a large degree a psychological matter, as opposed to just intellectual. So here she's talking about people surrendering their values here on this earth in the vain hope of values after we die. So jumping ahead again, 1940 was the publication of her first major big selling work, The Fountainhead, which is maybe one of the ones you've heard about. And there's not very much going on in terms of religion in this novel. That drops even further into the background. But there is an interesting exchange between the main character, Howard Rourke, and one of his early mentors. Why did you decide to be an architect? I didn't know it then, but it's because I've never believed in God. Come on, talk sense. Because I love this earth, that's all I love. I don't like the shape of things on this earth, I want to change them. So again, we're finding this worldly values. And then consider this, I thought this was an interesting line later when he has to give a speech in court. That man, the creator, the unsubmissive and first, stands in the opening chapter of every legend mankind has recorded about its beginning. Prometheus was chained to a rock and torn by vultures because he had stolen the fire of the gods. Adam was condemned to suffer because he had eaten the fruit of the tree of knowledge. So here, religion is basically portrayed as a backward sort of mysticism and something that stands in the way of us achieving our values here in this natural life. So it wasn't for another 17 years that Rand published another novel, and that's because it was a very long novel and much richer philosophically as far as coming goes. So I'm sure everybody's heard this, Atlas Shrugged. And so from 57. But in addition to, and so this of course has a political theme, right? But that's only the top level of the novel. There's much richer philosophical material, including a much more richly developed critique of religion. So there the main guy is John Gall, and he gives his infamous long speech. And here's a couple of lines from that talk. The good say the mystics of spirit is God, a being whose only definition is that he is beyond a man's power to conceive. A definition that invalidates man's consciousness and nullifies his concepts of existence. The good say the mystics of muscleless society, a thing which they define as an organism that possesses no physical form, a super being, embodying no one in particular and everyone in general, except yourself. The mystics of both schools are germs that attack you through a single sore point, your fear of relying on your mind. They tell you that they possess a means of knowledge higher than the mind, a mode of consciousness superior to reason. So here we're getting the portrayal of the transcendent values, whether it's heaven or some sort of transcendent collective good, as being antagonistic to human reason. And again, we're getting the idea that religion serves a psychological need, which is here people are afraid to rely on their own reasoning judgment to learn about the world around them. So that was Rand's last work of fiction that she actually published and completed. But she did start to write a lot on nonfiction issues, and she started to give a lot of talks. And in these talks, she started to attack religion even more directly and explicitly. So, for example, in 1960, she gave a talk called, at Yale, Faith and Force, Destroyers of the Modern World. One of her subtle titles that she's so well known for. And this is, I think, pretty interesting philosophically. Reason, she writes, is the faculty which perceives, identifies, and integrates the material provided by man's senses. Mysticism is a claim to non-sensory means of knowledge. So obviously, reason over faith here. But this is also interesting. Faith and force are corollaries, and mysticism will always lead to the rule of brutality. The cause of it is contained in the very nature of mysticism. Reason is the only objective means of communication and understanding among men. But when men claim to possess supernatural means of knowledge, no persuasion, communication, or understanding is possible. And so I think that this offers a good lesson to the American values network, which is explicitly attempting to replace reason with faith in the realm of politics. If Rand is correct, and I think she is, then the inevitable result of that, if consistently pursued, is ending up with some sort of rule by brute force. A lot of people today, especially, regard Ayn Rand as some sort of arch-conservative, right? She is Mrs. Conservative. These people would be surprised to learn that she, in fact, regularly denounced conservatism. I'll just read a short passage from another talk she gave in 1960 at Princeton called Conservatism and Obituary. And she's specifically criticizing conservatives for choosing religion as a moral justification. Quote, they claim that America and capitalism are based on faith in God. And she continues, politically, such a claim contradicts the fundamental principles of the United States. In America, religion is a private matter which cannot and must not be brought into political issues. And so I think that even people who disagree with Rand's conclusions in politics should appreciate her insistence on the method of reason, and that is how we should be working these problems out, not by appeal to a Bible or a God, no matter which one they might be. But it is unfortunate, I think, that today's religious left is threatening that very foundation, which is threatening the separation of church and state. So, through the rest of her life, she continued to appear in public and to write and speak about many, many things, right? But partly about religion and criticism of religion. In 1967 and 1968, she wrote 2 scathing attacks of a couple of the writings from the Catholic Church by the Pope. One was the Pope's attack, his religious attack on religion, his religious attack on capitalism, called Popularity Progressio. The other was his insistence that abortion be banned and contraception be banned on religious grounds. That was called Humanae Vitae. So, if you want to read Rand getting a little fired up, read her criticisms of those papal encyclicals. Interestingly, in 1976 and 1980, Ayn Rand opposed Ronald Reagan's run for president. And she did this, quote, because he opposes the right to abortion, which of course he did on faith-based religious grounds. And then she appeared on a variety of forums. She appeared on the Phil Donahue Show, for example, in 1979 and 1980, where she continued to criticize religion. So again, this is it's all through her intellectual life, from her first published writing, her first sold writing, through her last public appearances. In the background, because again, Rand thinks that positive philosophy is what matters, and that atheism is a secondary consequence of that. But still, it is there, and I think it's interesting to recognize. So let's summarize. What does Ayn Rand fight for? First, she fights for naturalism, the importance of this world and values in this world, and rejecting the supernatural realm as a concept. Rand focuses on reason, based on the evidence of the senses, as opposed to some sort of faith or mystical intuition. In morality, Rand is focused on the well-being and lives of particular individuals, not some transcendent source of value, be that religious or what she would regard as the secular equivalent of some kind of collective good above and beyond a particular individual. And then in politics, she looks to reason and individual rights to ground her politics. So I think that's a pretty interesting life, and she's had some interesting accomplishments. And yet today, Rand, more than any other literary figure, is the regular target of mean-spirited attacks by both the left and the right. Because of the left, of course, dislikes her capitalism, the right dislikes her atheism. And now apparently the left also dislikes her atheism. So, what I say is this: whether you agree or disagree with Rand's conclusions in ethics and politics, I think it's high time to recognize her as among the 20th century's greatest advocates of reason